Okay, so here I will continue further with the case study of Fritz Eichenberg, artist who I wrote my dissertation on. But the main thing about this is not necessarily to let you know more about Fritz Eichenberg, but to use this more as an example of what we're talking about in this class, theories. And this is one thing that I have in my dissertation, but you could put it in other ways. This is, if anything, kind of a detailed version. Ultimately, I guess you could call this inductive reasoning. I think I have that correctly. There's deductive reasoning and there's inductive reasoning. Anyone comment on the difference between inductive reasoning and deductive? So, deductive reasoning. I guess what we here, you could potentially put theory at the top of this page and then case studies at the bottom of this page. And here, this is how I'm talking about my dissertation. A case study of Fritz Eichenberg is in this very bottom part. I am particularly studying the relationship between creativity and spirituality. So that is ultimately my theory, is that creativity and spirituality can enhance each other, or they can potentially obstruct each other. Is basically my theory. Now, the first thing that you would do if I were to tell you this theory, I think the first thing you would do if you were really engaged would be to start saying, oh, you're saying creativity and spirituality can either enhance each other or obstruct each other. You might immediately start thinking of a particular artist, a particular musician. You might start immediately thinking of a particular creative person. And then you would say, would this be an example of creativity enhancing spirituality? Would this be a case of spirituality enhancing creativity? And that's a really good question to ask. That is ultimately basically the best question to ask, is to say, here's a theory. Now, how does it apply to specific cases? So ultimately, that's going to be deductive reasoning. You start with a theory, and then you start to say, does this apply to one case or another? Now, with that, sometimes if you start with a theory, you are kind of looking into cases, and you might be trying to kind of fit cases into your theory if it's deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning then is to just start with the particular case, not necessarily thinking of the theory, even though in my case, I do have the theory, but if I look at a particular case, what I'm trying to do is to notice particular things where I see the relationship between creativity and spirituality. And then I might start to say, this particular case that I noticed in one artist, I've noticed it in another artist and in another artist. And so after a while, if it occurs multiple times over various artists, then you might start to say, oh, this is kind of like potentially a theory, because I guess the scientifically it would be take an ice cube out on a sunny day, and the ice cube melts, and then you might say, okay, well, if I did the same thing again on another sunny day, it melts. After a while, you see the same thing happening, then you can start to say, this is a theory. There is something behind it. There's a reason for that happening. It's not just a coincidence, would be the thing. So a lot of times people might see something and they say, I guess you might say, whenever I watch the Seahawks, whenever I eat nachos when I'm watching the Seahawks, they win. Okay, you might have like a theory here, but then it's like, does that happen every time? Or there's, even if it looks like there's a connection there, eventually probably you will have nachos when the Seahawks are playing and they will lose, and it will prove your theory wrong. That, okay, there is no connection between that. So here's kind of how case studies work and how case studies can eventually lead up to theories is what we're trying to do. So with my case study on Fritz Eichenberg, I'm ultimately learning a lot about Fritz Eichenberg. I'm looking at his life very, very closely. But ultimately, I'm trying through my study of Fritz Eichenberg to see if I can find anything out about the relationship between creativity and spirituality. Okay. So here is to something I hadn't really spoken about previously about Fritz Eichenberg, but I did mention that Fritz Eichenberg, it's kind of hard to really describe his spirituality. You can't really just say, oh yeah, he was born Catholic and then he was Catholic his whole life. He was Jewish, born into a family that was non-practicing, secular Jewish, and eventually he became a member of the Society of Friends, also known as the Quakers. Now, I know that there is this book out here, and I think maybe this kind of describes Fritz Eichenberg. This is a book called Belief Without Borders, Inside the Minds of the Spiritual But Not Religious, SBNR. SBNR is a term for a variety of people, even though I don't know if this study really, if anyone has really applied this study back to early 20th century Germany, where Fritz Eichenberg was born and raised. This study mainly pertains to United States and Canada, I believe, in the later part of the 20th century, or maybe even the 21st century. Spiritual but not religious. People who will say, oh yeah, I am spiritual, but I don't really belong to any particular religious group. So Fritz Eichenberg was kind of like that. He was not particularly atheistic. He was not particularly opposed to religion. But he was not traditionally someone who we would say, oh, you belong to a religion in a traditional way as we understand it. Some of the way I describe Fritz Eichenberg's spirituality is also very closely connected to his artistic influences, particularly Francisco Goya and Honoré Daumier. Both of these artists were also very much cartoonists, not like cartoonists like Snoopy kind of thing, but more political cartoons. And sometimes like their cartoons were like, whoa, okay, that is not really funny. That's pretty serious. And the kind of humor might be really kind of strong, dark, yeah, sarcastic, and so forth. Like this one. So this is a critique of religion with Goya depicts basically, if you look and you see the hands are tree branches. So the idea here, Goya is trying to basically say, if you just put basically monks' robes onto a tree, some people will immediately fall onto their knees and start praying and worshiping. So it's a critique of religion. So this then gives us some insight into Goya, but it gives us some insight into Eichenberg. That, you know, this is kind of, these are Eichenberg's major influences. Goya, someone who, this is just one example, like many of his art images criticize religion. Fritz Eichenberg, this is an image that he made much, much later after growing up, but he refers to Lao Tse as someone who was a major influence on him. So again, I mentioned this Fritz Eichenberg, you know, also did appreciate religion from an early age as well, like the religion of Lao Tse, for example. So what I'm getting at here is that Fritz Eichenberg and his family fled from Nazi Germany to the United States in 1933. And he did produce some images, for example, images of St. Francis. He had always appreciated St. Francis, and that was an opportunity for him to include depictions of animals, which was something that Fritz Eichenberg always enjoyed doing. Somewhat soon after they moved to the US, Mary Eichenberg, his wife, suddenly became ill, rushed to the hospital, and died on the operating room table. So within 1 or 2 days, his wife goes from, you know, just being fine to feeling sick to being dead. This had a very, very strong impact on Fritz Eichenberg after a period of mourning, depression, and spiritual searching. Fritz Eichenberg became a member of the Society of Friends, the Quakers. So this was really his first, at the age probably about 39, his first association with a particular religion. I kind of mentioned this as well. There was an artist, a Quaker artist, Edward Hicks, who would depicted over 100 different variations of the peaceable kingdom. And Fritz Eichenberg himself made his own versions of the peaceable kingdom. And this is based on the biblical passage from Isaiah chapter 11, that the wolf shall be the guest of the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, the calf and young lion shall browse together, the cow and bear shall graze, their young shall lie down, lion shall eat hay like the ox, the baby shall play in the viper's den, and so forth. So in Isaiah, a vision of a future where basically enemies represented by animals will be at peace with each other, is some of the Quaker spirituality, but that is part of Christianity and Judaism as a whole as well. Also, during this time, actually, before and after Mary Eichenberg's death, he had been illustrating Crime and Punishment and completed the illustrations after that. So it's kind of an interesting connection to see what he was working on at the time. His illustrations for Crime and Punishment. And then eventually met Dorothy Day. This kind of shows what they were both doing in 1933, even though they did not meet until 1949. And Dorothy Day was co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, really a movement within the Catholic Church with very, 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 very strong emphasis on social justice. But sometimes social justice movements and organizations were very, very heavily into advocacy and potentially demonstrating, trying to change laws, things like that. But the Catholic worker actually had a strong combination of that kind of advocacy combined with nuts and bolts, soup kitchens, feeding the poor, potentially sometimes providing housing and things like that, works of charity. Here's actually Fritz Eichenberg's cover illustration for the autobiography of Dorothy Day. When I say Dorothy Day co-founded the Catholic worker movement, that is to mention Peter Morin, who also was a very big part of founding the Catholic worker. Here, I've shown this before, one of Fritz Eichenberg's most well-known illustrations for the Catholic worker. So what I'm ultimately looking at here particularly is the death of Fritz Eichenberg's wife and how that led Fritz Eichenberg more into a specific spiritual searching that led him to become Quaker. And in my mind, I take that as a certain point in his life where he goes more into a spiritual search, and potentially that the death of a loved one can instigate or it can be sort of a sign of a spirituality within someone. As I mentioned, Fritz Eichenberg, it's kind of hard to really describe his spirituality as far as association with a particular religion. So here I am also looking at a couple of books by Jane Dillenberger, who is a scholar in the area of art and religion. She has passed away some years ago, but she wrote a book, The Religious Art of Andy Warhol, which might seem, if anyone's familiar with the art of Andy Warhol, might seem that he did not produce that much religious art or that he was not a religious person. But this is really what Jane Dillenberger is looking into. And she's also written a book, co-wrote a book on the religious art of Picasso. Again, the idea of, well, was Picasso really a religious person? Did he produce religious art? So these books really do kind of go into those particular topics that are not immediately obvious as to what their answers would be. I actually was able to be there. Jane Dillenberger was a professor at Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, where I studied. I never took a class with her, but when her book was released, there was an event celebrating, and here I was able to be there for that. So she does look at some of the religious art that Andy Warhol produced and associate some of this with death, or at least an encounter with death. She looks at the religious art of Andy Warhol being produced in the later periods of his life, and also that potentially when Andy Warhol was shot, he was shot in 1968, and he did survive and live beyond that. However, Jane Dillenberger looks at his being shot as a time where he became aware of I mean, we all know that we are going to die, but we might not really conscientiously think about it, but sometimes potentially a near-death experience can bring that to our minds more prominently. And Jane Dillenberger thinks that with Andy Warhol, his being shot and potentially almost dying from that, even though he did live on and survive, as a time that really made Andy Warhol think more about religious themes, and to express religious themes in his art. Eventually, also, Andy Warhol met Pope John Paul II. Andy Warhol was Catholic. He was born into a Catholic family, and really was fairly devout throughout his life. Something that he wasn't very public about. But he did produce a number of variations on religious themes, variations of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. And also, I noticed in Jane Dillenberger's work on the religious life of Picasso, similar, that Picasso, particularly after the death of one of his really close friends, and this was a time where Picasso was probably in his early 20s, so at a pretty young age, had moved from Spain to Paris to seek to become a famous, make a living as an artist. And his friend Casahemus died by suicide. So again, this is an encounter with death in the case of the death of a close friend. The whole story is really quite sad when you think about it, that Casahemus was a fellow artist and had fallen in love with a woman, but had come to realize that he was sexually impotent, basically, not able to consummate a relationship sexually. And for this reason was basically rejected by the woman he was in love with. And at a particular event, he shot her. She did survive. And then he shot himself and he died. An encounter with death of a very close friend for Picasso at this time. And this is really seen as one of the early images of Picasso's blue period. This is maybe one of the more well-known images of the blue period, where the whole tone of his paintings are quite somber. And I really think of the blue period as probably Picasso's most spiritual period, in the sense that it's just easier to kind of connect with his feelings of sympathy for his subjects. There is some degree of abstraction here, but not to the level that you would see later. So just really think sensitive, somber depictions of his subjects that might not really have overtly religious meanings, but kind of evoke kind of religious meanings in his images. Images of people really kind of marginalized people of society, the hardworking people. And this one of his self-portraits that is almost unrecognizable as Picasso, as far as he typically doesn't have his hair parted in this way. Very rarely throughout his life does he have a beard as in this, so it wouldn't really immediately appeal to someone as a self-portrait of Picasso. Particularly if you look at later self-portraits, you can see increasingly more abstraction. 1906, 1907, you start to see much more abstraction. And here we're jumping up quite a bit into 1965. But throughout his career, he made a variety of self-portraits, but really never really as subdued and somber as this self-portrait from the Blue period. Again, what I'm now looking at is the idea of death as potentially life event that can open an artist to religious themes in their art. Right now, if I look at Fritz Eichenberg, Andy Warhol, and Picasso, I'm not sure if it really ties in together, but it's kind of at least the starting point. So, as far as, how do people come up with theories? We've been talking about theories. Theories is basically what this class is about. How do people come up with theories? And so here is just kind of to show, we've certainly read through textbooks where it's like, here are people who came up with theories, and we're reading about theories after the fact that they've already been constructed. So here is also to try to show, here's a theory that isn't really fully developed, but kind of some parts, and maybe showing like an insider's look of how will a theory be developed from its beginnings, as opposed to looking at things at the end. So one way is then to take a few different case studies and see if there is some kind of commonality with those. Okay, so we did have one presentation rescheduled for Wednesday, but I think I will also give the option to attend class either in person or on Zoom for Wednesday. And I may also present on something after our students' presentations. So we'll see about that. Otherwise, thank you all, and see you next time.